Hello, folks. So, the topic of discussion today is going to be class, which is an often ignored aspect of socio political dynamics in India. Even though the political pundits of the day might not seem overtly concerned with discussing class, the term certainly has percolated down to the lexicon of the average Joe on the street. Middle class, upper class, lower class, upper middle class, lower middle class. These are all relatively well known terms across most of Indian society, at least in the urban areas of the country. The problem with applying commonly held notions of class to understanding political inclinations is that they're often ill defined, contradictory, and sometimes just statistically nonsensical. As an example, if you were to talk to an auto rickshaw driver today, earning about 25,000 rupees a month for his household of 4 to 5 people, it is all too possible that he'd say people like him constitute the real middle class, and people who have their own cars and live in flats are actually the upper class. Conversely, the latter category of people would laugh at this idea and they'd say that they're the real middle class and the auto rickshaw driver is clearly among the urban poor. To wade through these contradictions, one might think that it would be better to rely on the experts for a more clear picture. But the thing is that economists and policymakers too have vastly different interpretations of who exactly constitutes the middle class, with estimates of the Indian middle class ranging from a measly 40 million or 4 crore people to a whopping 604 million people, which is more than 60 crore people. For the sake of clarity, let's stick to the definition used by the National Council of Applied Economic Research, according to which the cutoff to be middle class is an income of at least $10 per day, which is around 750 rupees. Now, this definition appears to be sound compared to the more expansive definitions, particularly because if you want to make a comparison to global standards, it seems more appropriate. As per the criteria of this definition, there are about 78 million adults in India in the middle class or above category, a number which constitutes only about 10% of our 18 plus demographic. These are the kind of people who can afford to buy air conditioners, motor vehicles, go on a vacation, and not have too much trouble affording the college fees of their kids. Now, if we were to try and separate this grouping further to figure out who is middle class and who is actually upper class or rich, it'd be an exercise filled with even more complexity and vagueness compared to getting a reasonable definition of the Indian middle class. So, for the ease of calculation, let's imagine that our upper class neatly fits into the much hated 1% category. According to a study by Oxfam, this 1% category owns 51.33% of the wealth in India, while the top 10% of the population holds 77.4% of all wealth. This would mean that the 1% holds about twice as much wealth as the next 9%, and just goes to show how concentrated economic power is in India. Now, our 9% middle class group neither has the numbers to be a substantial counterweight to the voters of classes lower to it, who constitute 90% of the population, nor, as we've just seen, does it have the economic power to come anywhere close to the economic heft exercised by the upper class. So, does this mean that this group's voice is largely irrelevant to the political actors of our country? Well, of course not. What this group lacks in terms of numbers or wealth, it makes up for in sheer influence over the political narrative. Most journalists, writers for newspapers, bloggers, grassroots political organizers, lawyers, TV anchors, teachers, academics, etc., fall in this 9% group. Their political voice is incredibly powerful to say the least. Moreover, the country's middle class won't forever be stagnant or restricted to this 9% group. Even with a suboptimal utilization of India's demographic dividend, tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions, are going to be added to the Indian middle class in the coming decades, making this class numerically much more significant. And you might also ask, how will the addition of so many millions of people change the very character of the Indian middle class and by extension, Indian politics? Well, firstly, the process of westernization and anglicization are going to more prominently affect much greater chunks of our population. especially in big metro cities where the middle class and the upper class will together soon become majorities. This may mean a lot more voters are going to be interested in rationalized income tax brackets, more social freedoms, but also at some point more progressive ideas which may just be directly copy pasted into the Indian context from the West. This also means that the religious attitudes, which have already started to blossom among the upper class and the upper middle class, particularly right now, will also likely percolate down to a much larger demographic, especially so among the Hindus, since religious doctrines in Hinduism are much more flexible and less rigid compared to Islam or even Christianity. Although it is early to say to what degree this will impact the sway Hindutva holds among the Hindu masses currently, it goes without saying that either the character of Hindutva itself will change to present a less ritualistic and more nuanced face, or that its hold over its existing adherents will fray considerably. Another important change will be affected by the ever greater accumulation of capital by the upper class relative to the expanding middle class, or more specifically, the upper middle class, which will likely solidify itself as a class in its own right at some point in the future. To better understand this, let's look at the changing fortunes of the elites and the upper middle class in the US in the last few decades. Since 1979, earnings of the top 1% in the US have grown at thrice the rate as that of the top 10% group as a whole, while the top 0.1% have seen their earnings grow twice as fast as the top 1% group. The elites, that is the 1% and the 0.1% groups, have so vastly overperformed compared to the largely professional or managerial class, which makes up most of the top 10%, that the gap between the earnings growth of the 1% or 0.1% and the top 10%, on the other hand, is in fact greater than the gap between the earnings growth of the top 10% and the bottom 90%. Now, if we see the same pattern taking hold in the Indian context in the decades to come, it would breed massive resentment among the upper middle class here, who would at some point begin to doubt all the neoliberal platitudes about the wonders of modern day capitalism. If this occurs, then an Indian Bernie Sanders like figure, along with a new left type of discourse, could become prominent among members of this class. A 1% versus the 99% political narrative could percolate down from the upper middle class to the rest of the population, becoming a decisive factor in future elections, with growing calls for wealth redistribution, affirmative action, and an expansion of the state in many ways. What nationalist thinkers in India, as well as in general right wing ideologues, need to do as soon as possible is to refine their talking points, take control of new forms of media, and really just begin addressing concerns which are going to emerge from changing class dynamics. It is only by being prepared for a sea change in class relations that the right wing in India can secure its position as the dominant voice in the country's political space in the decades to come. That's all for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit the subscribe button if you did. There's going to be more interesting and informative political content in the future.